Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate at St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. As we continue our series on Pope Francis Apostolic Exhortation, Rejoice and Be Glad, today's Do You Know question is, do you know the two subtle enemies of holiness? In Chapter 2, Pope Francis focuses on two false ways of looking at holiness, or as he calls them, two enemies of holiness. And these he names as Gnosticism and Pelagianism. Now these two terms go all the way back to the early church, but he recaptures them as material that was obviously condemned in the early church, but somehow or other have perdured and continued to exist in our day as really powerful enemies of our call to holiness and our growth to holiness. We'll focus on Gnosticism first. Gnosticism comes from the word to know, basically, and so Gnostics are people who emphasize right knowledge, right way of thinking. They are people who are full of bits of information and thoughts that somehow or other seem to impress, but somehow or other do not touch personally or do not really connect with others. I often think of Gnostics as know-it-alls. These are people, I'm sure you've come across people like this, these are people whose ideas are the only ones that are valid, the only ones that are legitimate, and they're not open to any other new ways of looking at things or whatever, and they insist that their way is the only way, and they judge others based on their way of thinking and so on. And so what happens in this particular case is they get so caught up and enslaved in their own ideas that they're not open to other possibilities and other ways of looking at things. Pope Francis, interesting enough, insists that this is the wrong path. This is actually an enemy to holiness because it prevents us from really opening ourselves to God's grace. And a quote that I would like to use directly from Pope Francis is number 37 of his Rejoice and Be Glad, which states that, thanks be to God, throughout the history of the Church, it has always been clear that a person's perfection is measured not by the information or knowledge they possess, but by the depth of their charity. And so the focus, therefore, in our call to holiness is on the depth of our charity, on the way the information and the wisdom that we gain from others helps us to live a life of charity, and not to be caught up in right ideas and right ways of thinking because those are the ways that are going to be path to God. Oftentimes, with regards to people who get caught up on this, they really are so caught up in their ideas that they really are not open to God's working, God's grace working in our lives, and they really limit, if you want, the grace of God. They don't allow God to be God. They don't allow the Spirit to blow where it wills. They domesticate, if you want, in many ways, with their thoughts. They think that they domesticate God's mystery and that they really have control on God's transcendence. Francis says this is obviously the wrong path. Another brief quote that he has, which I think is right on target with regards to Gnostics, is from number 41 of Rejoice and Be Glad, when he says, when someone has an answer for every question, it is a sign they are not on the right road. And so everything for the Gnostics tends to be clear, precise, has to be exact, and so on. So much so that apologetics, the correct way of answering questions and so on, is the only way that one responds to questions or concerns or doubts. And Pope Francis says, no, that is the wrong way. As a matter of fact, mercy and love and God's compassion are the companion to wisdom. That wisdom, information, knowledge only are to dare to help us live lives of love and concern for God and one another, and not just to be focused on right thoughts or right ways of thinking. The second enemy of holiness that Pope Francis insists on is called Pelagianism. Now, Pelagianism is the flip side, if you want, of Gnosticism. Instead of focusing on right thinking and the thoughts and the mind, this focuses on the will and right actions. In other words, what the Pelagians do is essentially focus on the fact that we can save ourselves through our own efforts and through our own actions, and that God's grace, while there, doesn't really play much of a role in all of this. And so as a result, they kind of focus almost strictly on certain rules, certain ways of doing things, and so on, and insist that these are the only ways in which salvation can occur, and everyone has to abide by those particular actions and those strict way of observing things in order to be saved. And what they do is, again, they eliminate God's grace in this whole process, because as Pope Francis very clearly insists that it is God's grace that saves us, not our own efforts. God's loving initiative that continually is with us and helps us to walk that journey of faith. That's what saves us. I'd like to zero in on one quote from Pope Francis from this document again that emphasizes that. This is quote number 52 from Rejoice and Be Glad. And it states very clearly, "The Church has repeatedly thought that we are justified not by our own works or efforts, but by the grace of the Lord who takes the initiative." And so it's extremely important to counter this particular enemy called Pelagianism, because it really kind of restricts God's grace and God's love in our lives, and actually prevents God's love from working in our lives. Pope Francis ends this chapter by emphasizing what he calls the hierarchy of virtues. And the hierarchy of virtues are, among the many virtues, love is the one that dominates and is the most important of all. Love, as Pope Francis insists with regards to Jesus, is when asked what was the fulfillment of the law, what was the greatest commandment of the law, he said, love God and love your neighbor. This above all else. So when we love God and we love our neighbor, that is the most important virtue, and all else is a distraction. He closes with one line, and that one line is that because these tendencies persist in our human tendencies, he says we need to examine ourselves to see if these tendencies exist in our own lives, and they could be enemies of our growth in holiness. So I hope this has helped to explain just a bit of what the two enemies of holiness are according to Pope Francis, and I hope you'll return again to more series questions as we continue to explore this important document of Pope Francis, Rejoice and Be Glad. Thank you very much.